Welcome to another episode of the Jarring Science Club. I'm your host, Brenda, and today we're going to be learning about different climate zones around the world and how climate is different from weather. Today's activity is not an experiment, it is a demonstration of the types of climate zones. We will be building a model of each of the climate zones inside of a jar. All right, let's get started. Here's what you need. 5 jars, they do not have to match, some dirt, some snow, you can use real snow if you have it, some sand, and you'll also need some items to represent the types of plants and animals that you would see in each climate zone. I found a bag of animals and bugs and things on Amazon, and that's what we're using to create our models. You may also want to add in a couple of other things like little flowers or snowflakes, depending on what you can find in your classroom or at home. All right, let's get started. All right, guys, we're here to make our climate jars. So these are going to represent the 5 different climate zones in the world, the 5 main climate zones. The first one we're going to make is the polar zone. The polar zone is found at the poles, obviously, and it's got a lot of ice, a lot of snow, and just a couple of animals. The north and south poles, you have polar bears and penguins. Penguins live mainly at the South Pole, and polar bears live mainly in the North Pole. But in our polar zone jar, we're gonna put both. When you're done making your zone jars, you can use the labels that are included in your lesson to label each of the zones in case you forget. Our polar zone is done. Next, we're gonna make our tropical zone. Tropical zone is mainly found in the center of the world around the equator. When you think tropical, you think beachy, islandy. The base for this jar is gonna be sand. We're putting in a rock to represent a lot of tropical regions have volcanoes and things like that. Like Hawaii, you see a lot of dormant or active volcanoes. Here's some little grass to represent some tropical grass. A rainbow for sunshine. We got a gorilla here because gorillas are often live in tropical regions, and a little umbrella. And there's our tropical jar. Next, we're gonna make our temperate climate zone. We'll use soil as a base. Temperate climates are where most of us live, so you'll see the kind of things that you're familiar with and used to. So let's put in a little tree. And just some standard forest creatures. We got a little squirrel, a little bear, and we'll put in some flowers. These are actually pea flowers. The next zone we're gonna make is the desert zone. So we'll use sand as a base again. And we'll put in some rocks. And then we'll put in this little lizard to represent the desert creatures. And our final climate zone is continental. Continental regions do get warm to a certain extent, but their winters are very cold. So we're gonna represent this jar being continental in that it has seasons, but it also gets very cold winters. So we're gonna put some snow in here too. There's our snow, but we still have a little bit of vegetation in there in our continental zone. So we'll put in this grass. And then the kind of animals you get in a continental zone are these kind of winter hardy creatures like foxes and bears. So we'll put them in there. Jarring Science Club. Today we're going to be focusing on the NGSS standard ESS 2-2, which is Earth systems. We're going to be learning about the different types of climate zones throughout the United States and the world. Climate is basically a range of expected type of weather for an area. Climate zones vary depending on where you are in the world. Because the Earth is a big sphere and it rotates in space, the sun hits different parts of the Earth at different times of the year. And depending on how close the Earth is to the sun or where the location that you're in is on the globe, different amounts of sun will hit you in different intensities. In the center of the globe, around the equator, that's the middle of the Earth, that is the hottest, most temperate climate in the world. Because no matter where you are in orbit, the sun is always going to be hitting the most intensely in the center of the Earth. So it's the warmest climate. At the top and bottom of the Earth are the poles. And those tend to be the coldest because no matter what time of year it is, they get the least amount of sun. So they are always going to be the coldest. And depending on how close you are to the poles versus how close you are to the equator, that's going to determine what your climate zone is. In the United States, if you live in the United States, there are different specific climate zones just in the United States because it's such a large country. It covers a wide range of latitude. There are 5 main types of climate zones in the world: polar, tropical, temperate, continental, and dry. In a tropical zone, it is warm and wet. It's usually hot and humid in these zones, and they're often located near the equator in the center of the Earth. To qualify as a tropical zone, you have to have a lot of rain, typically more than 59 inches per year. Hawaii is an example of a tropical zone. Another climate zone is a dry climate zone. These can be located at different parts of the world. A dry zone is defined by how much moisture is in the air. Very little moisture makes it a dry zone. Typically deserts will be dry zones, and they're often hot, but not always. Arizona is an example of a dry zone. A lot of people live in temperate zone areas. That's because historically, they were easier to survive in these temperate zones. This is where you have your typical 4 seasons of the year, and the winters don't get too cold and the summers don't get too hot. It's a well-balanced climate zone. Ohio is an example of a temperate zone. A continental zone is starting to get colder. Usually the summers are mild and the winters get very, very cold. Temperatures can sometimes fall below -30 degrees Celsius, which is extremely cold. 0 degrees Celsius is freezing. Continental temperatures are seen in Alaska. The polar zone is typically what you see at the North and South Pole. It is the coldest zone. It is cold and freezing throughout the entire year, and usually temperatures never go higher than 10 degrees Celsius, even on the warmest days of summer. And polar climates are seen in Antarctica. All of weather on Earth is driven by climate patterns, but different parts of the world have different weather patterns. These are known as their climate zones. Energy from the sun, when it hits the surface of the Earth, determines what climate you are. The heat is absorbed in different rates depending on where you are on the world and where the Earth is in orbit. How the Earth's atmosphere responds to the heat from the sun plays a big role in different climate zones. The sun's energy hits the center of the globe at the equator in the strongest amount. But because the Earth likes to be in balance, you will get the heat spreading from the center out towards the poles. This gives you the different climate zones. Warm air moves from the equator towards the poles, creating weather. When you have a high temperature and a moist environment, you're more likely to have a tropical zone, versus when you have warm air and a dry climate, you're more likely to have a desert zone. One job relating to climates is a climatologist or a climate scientist. These scientists track weather patterns and changes over time in different climate zones to help inform us about how the way we live and the way the Earth is changing is affecting the greater climate zones. For example, thousands and millions of years ago, many of the areas where people live today, like California and Florida and even Texas where I live, were once under an ocean. This is because during the Ice Age, there was a lot cooler temperatures on the Earth. Areas were colder, there was more ice and more water. It didn't evaporate as quickly, so there were more wet locations. And many of the areas that we can now live in today, we couldn't have lived in millions of years ago because they would have been underwater. When I was growing up in Texas, my house actually had a bunch of old limestone fossils from snails and little small seashells that we would just be able to dig up in our backyard because not that long ago, it was the bed of an ocean. Pretty cool, right? In our experiment, we made climate zone jars to represent the type of climate and weather that you would see in each of our climates. It's a fun way to kind of make a model of the different climate zones right here at home without having to visit. That's it for today. See you next time.